I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Sebastian Bourdais. That guy was running 4th in a Toro Rosso, holding off a double world champion on his debut. It's just a shame that his Ferrari engine gave up on him, but to be honest, he couldn't really have asked for a better first impression than that. Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver goes to David Coulthard for turning in on Felipe Massa and for using naughty words. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Jacques Villeneuve for his spectacular win. He had to fight through from 4th and also pass his teammate and accelerate into the lead to win by 20 seconds. Just phenomenal. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to... any guesses? Pedro Lamy. Yeah, that's right. You thought I was gonna say Lavaggi, but give the guy a break. At least he didn't stall at the start and lose several laps. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Damon Hill, because I feel that this may well have even been his best drive ever. And although I really want to give the Inoue Trophy to Inoue, well, I'm afraid I have to give it to Giovanni Lavaggi, who wombled around at the back 2 seconds off the pace and then spun off. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Gerhard Berger, because duh. He took pole position by 0.6 of a second, commanded the entire race, and then won it by 17 seconds. That's really quite something, especially since the Ferrari was really not that quick that year. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Philippe Strife, the driver of the white car there, who was over a second a lap slower than his teammate Palmer and finished 2 laps down in a car that was definitely capable of better. I'll give the Driver of the Day award to Stefan Belov. After all, 19th on the grid to 4th in the race is nothing to be sniffed at, especially when achieved in a car with compromised aero and an outdated and underpowered engine. It was the last points ever scored by a DFE engine in Formula 1, and sadly the last points ever scored by Belov himself, as he died in a sports car accident at Spa-Francorchamps just a few weeks later. This was a performance to show just what might have been had he had a longer career in Formula 1 and a longer life. May he rest in peace. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Performance to Nigel Mansell for losing the lead immediately, spinning twice, and then crashing out. Oopsie doopsie.
Well, Caitlin, my Driver of the Day is Michele Alboreto, and the reason for that is very simple. He was in a car that was theoretically not supposed to win, due to the fact that 1982 as a whole seemed to be mostly favoring the turbo cars, like the Renaults, the Ferraris, and the like, and his lowly, naturally aspirated Cosworth DFV-powered Tyrrell, that's a mouthful, basically was the David among Goliaths in this event. And it wasn't through attrition or anything, it was basically him driving the nuts off the car. This was, I think, one of his best drives in Formula 1.
I would agree with that, Chris, but I'm going to give my Driver of the Day to Eddie Cheever in 3rd, who I think also drove the nuts of an under-fancied car and is equally worthy of Driver of the Day. I'll give my Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Brian Henton, who we didn't see at all except in the background of some shots, who was lapped and failed to score points despite driving the same car as Alboreto, who won. Henton was dropped from his seat and replaced by Danny Sullivan for 1983, who sadly didn't do much better.
And Caitlin, the Inoue Trophy I'm going to be giving to the Caesars Palace circuit itself. Boy, oh boy. Having watched both of these races, along with both kart events that ran 2 years after the Formula 1 cars did, I can safely say that Caesars Palace was one of, if not the worst circuits in Formula 1, and also the one that was the most ill-conceived. It had no flow, and quite frankly, it had no challenge to it, apart from the heat. It was an absolute dog to sit through.
I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to... well, I feel pressured to give it to Parnas since this was his only win, but I'm held back by his desperate pass on Irvine. I also want to give it to Hill, but I feel like he retired too early so we don't know what may have happened. As a result, I'm actually going to give the Driver of the Day award to John Alesi, who, let's not forget, was running second for most of the race before briefly leading and then retiring through no fault of his own. Many people say that the Benetton that year was good enough to win races and that the drivers were the issue. I say bullspit. I'll give the the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to everyone who crashed out on the first lap, with those being Michael Schumacher, Rubens Barrichello, Pedro Lamy, Giancarlo Fisichella and Jos Verstappen. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Martin Brundle for his wonderful defensive driving. Had his gearbox not blown, he would likely have scored a podium finish in front of his home crowd, just as he had done the year before, and I think he deserved to do so. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Michael Andretti because, I mean, come on, what was that? I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Jody Scheckter because I feel that he's always been unfairly blamed for the collision and I think he would have won this race. Instead, he was sidelined by McLaren after the Silverstone shunt and would have to wait another year for his maiden victory. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Emerson because only one driver crashed in this Grand Prix and Emerson happened to be that driver. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Sebastian Buemi because although Kobayashi's praises are often sung for this race, everyone seems to forget that Buemi managed to score a point in a far inferior car, which ended up last in that year's standings. Dragging that car to 8th place was quite honestly amazing. I also don't feel that anyone really deserves the Inoue Trophy, and it's really hard to pick between Kubica, Kovalainen, Grosjean and Fisichella, but I think I'll have to give it to Fisichella for his drive-through penalty. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Juan Pablo Montoya, because finishing second in just your 5th Grand Prix is an impressive feat at the best of times, but from 12th on the grid? Not bad at all. No one really stood out to me for the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver, so I'll give it to Tarso Marquez, who just wasn't very fast. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Eric Kermas, who made up 15 positions to finish 10th in the woeful Ligier. That would have given him a point in the modern day. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Mauricio Gugelmin for finishing behind Kermas in a Leighton house that was capable of points. I gave the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Jenson Button for his charge up the field, his overcoming of issues, and his amazing overtake on Alonso. I still maintain that this was Jenson's best ever season, beating out even 2009 and 2011. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Rubens Barrichello for his first lap collision and failure to progress through the order. Look, I'm a fan of Rubens and I think he's great, but P12 in an F2004, seriously? It's worth noting that he limped home with a puncture, but even so, he wouldn't have scored any points. For the second episode in a row, I'll give the Driver of the Day award to Jenson Button, who was really sticking it to the big guns in that Renault and managed to avoid being lapped by the Ferraris. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Giancarlo Fisichella for committing the cardinal sin of F1. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Bertrand Gachot, who managed to finish 6th and score Venturi's only ever point in Formula 1, despite the fact his teammate Katayama had failed to even pre-qualify for this very same event. This was also Gachot's own last point in Formula 1, as after this he spent a year away from the sport before returning for 2 fruitless years at Pacific. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Pierluigi Martini for crashing out on the very first lap. Now, I had a little bit of trouble deciding who should be Driver of the Day, since there were so many drivers who deserved it. I wondered, should it go to Damon Hill for his grand slam of pole, fastest lap and victory by 2 laps, or was it too simple once all his competitors dropped out? Should it go to Olivier Panis for his ability to drag a smoking wreck across the line in second, or was the fact that he finished 2 laps down too much for detractor? Should it go to Gianni Morbidelli for his fantastic podium finish, or would we all have paid no attention to his performance if it hadn't been for all the attrition? I honestly didn't know, so I decided to decide it in the fairest way possible. It's Hill! I gave the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Taki Inoue, because let's face it, it had to be. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Jenson Button, who I once again maintain should be celebrated just as much for his 2004 season as his 2009 one, and so nearly got his first win on this occasion. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Ralf Schumacher for this whole episode. Yes, I know he had damage, but this was just dangerous. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Frentzen, who was doing a fantastic job up until his accident, which quite simply wasn't his fault. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Jarno Trulli, because damn, that's a lot of damage.
It's not my fault.
I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Piquet, who won on a day that really should have belonged to either McLaren or Ferrari. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Roberto Moreno, who finished 7th and a lap down in the other Benetton. Chris and I will both pick a Driver of the Day award for Best Driver, but I'll give mine to Shinji Nakano, who climbed all the way up from 18th on the grid to 7th, so nearly scoring a point in the woeful Minardi. I'll give my Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Mika Salo, who was largely to blame for the second start crash and then lost it all by himself later on.
Well, for Driver of the Day, I'm going to pick Jan Magnussen. And only because he scored his only Grand Prix points for the Stewart team in what turned out to be his final race as he was let go for the French Grand Prix. As for the Inoue Trophy, well, gonna have to go with Alexander Wurz for this one well, you all saw it. A dishonorable mention goes to Pedro Diniz for tearing up the city of Montreal's sod.
I gave the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Heinz-Harald Frentzen, who held off Barrichello in the late stages to score the Arrows team's last ever point in F1, just 5 races before they pulled the plug entirely. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Alex Young, who had an off under double-waved yellows and then later crashed by himself. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Nigel Mansell, who made up for a bad qualifying position by climbing up the field to 4th. This award possibly could have gone to his teammate DeAngelis, but I feel he retired too early for us to know what his true form was. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Dr. Palmer, who was a long way off the pace before retiring from the race, although really there was no one truly deserving of this award. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Heinz-Harald Frentzen, who was up near the front for the whole thing, overcame the weird clunky gear thing, and won due to a superb strategy, although an honourable mention goes to Luca Badoa, who finished 10th for Minardi. That would be a point nowadays. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Giancarlo Fisichella, who spun twice on-screen and then once more off-screen, where he got beached and retired. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Ayrton Senna for his utter dominance, although Boutsen, Gasho, Bernard and Coma all deserve honourable mentions for gaining handfuls of positions just by lasting while others fell by the wayside. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Senna's teammate Berger, who crashed twice in 10 laps. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Fernando Alonso for showing Renault that cheating really isn't necessary when you can just be good. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Nick Heidfeld, who was painfully slow compared to his teammate and failed to score points. I'll give my Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Mika Salo, because even though we didn't see much of him, he was out there tearing up the track in his Toyota, bringing home one of just 2 points that they'd score that season. An honourable mention of course goes to Michael Schumacher, because this win was his 100th podium in Formula 1. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Felipe Massa, because unfortunately I think this collision with Webber was his fault, and he really should have been able to keep the engine running too. An honourable mention here goes to Pele, who did his best to balls up the result. Get it? I gave the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Luca Badoa, who had not just been running in the points when he retired, but in 4th frickin' position, in a Minardi! I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Terunosuke Takagi for being involved in 2 of the crunch count incidents. I gave the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Martin Brundle for climbing up from 13th to take his final podium in F1. It was very nearly 2nd place too, being yoinked away on the very last lap. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Luca Badoa, because Blanchimont is not normally a corner people have that kind of incident at. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Ralph Furman, who can call himself an F1 points finisher thanks to this race, despite having started back in 15th place on the grid. Furman had a tough time in F1, but in this race he drove beautifully. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to David Coulthard for this collision with Button. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Damon Hill, who led 2/3 of the race to score a big victory. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Johnny Herbert, who was rather slow and also rather anonymous, except for when he was spinning. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Rubens Barrichello, not just because he won, but because of the awesome manner in which he won. With that being said, on most other days this award would have gone to Jenson Button or Mika Salo, so they both deserve a shout out as well. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Ricardo Zonta, who caused 3 of this race's 5 crunch counts, including one where he ran into his own teammate. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Juan Pablo Montoya, who led from lights to flag despite his tyres threatening to fall apart. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for Worst Driver to Christian Albers for driving straight into Kartikeyan at the start. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Sebastian Vettel, who could so easily have lost all his confidence after his embarrassing crash with Mark Webber and Fuji, but who held strong to take both his own personal best result up to that point and also his team's. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Adrian Sutil, who didn't even have the decency to crash where we could see it. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Heinz Harald Frentzen, who not only scored a point but also hung on to the lead lap in his Jordan. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Pedro de la Rosa, who got lapped twice more than his teammate. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Gianni Morbidelli, who was running as high up as 3rd place before the red flag came out, scoring his first half point at the track where he would also score his last points and only podium finish 4 years later. As for the Inoue Trophy, I actually don't feel comfortable giving it to anyone in particular for this race, since it's hard to blame incidents on drivers when there were literally rivers of water running across the track. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Michele Alboreto, because what a race he had! He took the lead, then caught some oil and slid wide, then retook the lead, then picked up a puncture, then repassed both De Cesaris and De Angelis on his way to 2nd place. If he'd had just slightly more luck in this race, he'd have won it for sure. Honourable mentions go to the Ligier drivers, as De Cesaris scored his only points of the season in 4th place, and Lafitte finished 6th despite starting 16th and then spinning on the oil. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Patrick Tambay, who didn't even get to turn 1 before making like Homer Simpson and taking a bite out of burger.
Burger.
I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Gabriele Tarquini, who finished 6th from down in 17th on the grid to score AGS's final point in Formula 1. It was also Gabriele's only points finish in F1, which makes it quite sad that it was barely even caught on camera, as the broadcast director focused almost entirely on the McLarens. Seriously, there must have been an awesome battle over 6th, 7th, 8th, etc. that the cameras just didn't even bother with, and we got next to no replays of anything. Oh well, I guess that's the 80s for you. Honourable mentions go to Ayrton Senna, who absolutely dominated the race, Alessandro Nannini, who was 4th from 13th on the grid, and Eddie Cheever, who was 7th from 24th. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Andrea De Cesaris, who spun, restarted, spun again, had a lengthy pit stop, got in the way of the leaders, and then retired, all in about 20 laps. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Nelson Piquet Jr., because even though he got lucky with the timing of the safety car, you can't ignore that he was extremely good in the latter stages, pulling away from Massa and making Alonso look like a rookie. There are alternate universes out there where Hamilton lost time behind Massa and now Nelson is a Grand Prix winner, and I think it's a shame that his F1 career ended so bitterly. I really do think he had potential, and I think he could have shown that in any other team than Renault. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to David Coulthard, because I really think he should have seen Barrichello coming in this clumsy collision. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Shinji Nakano, who finished in a strong 6th position despite starting way down in 19th on the grid. His race actually shares a lot of similarities with the Driver of the Day from my last video, Gabriele Tarquini at the 1989 Mexican Grand Prix. In both cases, the driver came through from a lowly grid slot to take their first ever point in F1, and in both cases the cameras barely picked up on them at all. Honourable mentions go to Michael Schumacher for a strong win, Johnny Herbert for finishing 5th despite his penalty, David Coulthard, who was desperately unlucky, Pedro Diniz for finishing ahead of his world champion teammate, and Alex Wirtz, who was running in the points on his debut until his transmission gave up off camera. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Jacques Villeneuve, who crashed out of a race he could absolutely have won. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Ayrton Senna, because, well, duh. The effort of this drive was so great that he had to be taken to the podium by medical car, and he could barely lift the trophy. With that being said, an honourable mention does have to go to Gianni Morbidelli, who finished 8th in his Minardi from 21st on the grid, although unfortunately the points only went down to 6th in those days. As for the Inoue Trophy, no one really stood out as being particularly bad, but I'll give the award for worst driver to Roberto Moreno, who was rather slow all day and nearly got lapped by his teammate. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Michael Schumacher, who put on one of the drives of his life out in front, even though he arguably didn't need to. Honourable mentions, of course, go to Rubens Barrichello for his first podium finish, Eric Comas for a great recovery drive to 6th in the Larousse, and Johnny Herbert and Pedro Lamy, who finished 7th and 8th to just miss out on what would have been Lotus's only points of the season. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Michele Alboreto, because I mean really, what was this? I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Karl Wendlinger, who took his Sauber to a 6th place finish from down in 17th on the grid, although honourable mentions of course have to go to Damon Hill for winning in what was basically his rookie season, Martin Brundle for climbing from 13th to 5th, and Philippe Alliot, who narrowly missed out on points, finishing in 8th place from 19th on the grid. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Andrea De Cesaris, who just would not get out of the way, but nothing new there of course. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Quick Nick Heidfeld, who we barely saw any of, but who did an awesome job to climb from last place all the way up to 8th on home soil, actually passing his teammate Frentzen in the process. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to David Coulthard, who endangered his mechanics, himself, and Fernando Alonso in the space of about 10 minutes. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Philippe Alliot for winning the naturally aspirated class and also scoring points overall from 17th on the grid. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Adrian Campos, who seemed way out of his depth in the Minardi. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Sebastian Vettel, because even though he got overtaken on the last corner by Alonso, you have to admit that he did a fantastic job to climb up to such a high position in the first place, and then an even better job to bring it home on dry tyres. He must have passed his teammate somewhere off camera near the end of the race, and it's crazy to think that he actually wasn't that far away from scoring a podium. Of course, he would go one better at the next race by taking his very first Grand Prix win at a wet Monza, and you bet he'll be getting Driver of the Day there too if I ever cover that race. I'll give the Inoue Trophy for worst driver to Nelson Piquet Jr., who started on the wrong tyres for the conditions and then immediately crashed after bolting on the right ones. By accident, of course. I gave the Driver of the Day award for best driver to Nigel Mansell for his dominant Grand Chelem, the second of his career. Little did anyone know at the time, but he was actually driving with a broken left foot courtesy of his crash at the Australian Grand Prix the previous year. I'll give the Inoue Trophy to Olivier Griard, who jumped the start and then made it hard for the leader to pass him before he retired from the race.